The legendary Max Keiser and I were once colleagues and friends. He's gone away to Latin America and drifted somewhat politically also. We were never comrades, but we were friends. And I am one of his biggest admirers, not least because he advised me when the price was very, 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 very low to get into Bitcoin. Nowadays, Max Keiser is not just a presenter and a filmmaker, he is the chief advisor on Bitcoin to the president of El Salvador. Let's hear what he gets up to in that regard and in others. Max Keiser, how wonderful to see you again after a brief couple of year interlude. Tell us how you ended up in El Salvador and what you do there.
Yeah, George, great to see you. And let me bring you up to date on what Max and Stacy have been doing. We visited El Salvador at the end of 2021 after the president made Bitcoin legal tender. We sat down with him for a few hours, and by the end of that meeting, he convinced us to move to El Salvador and give some advice on the best way to roll out Bitcoin policy and how to build more Bitcoin into the economy. And that's what we've been doing now for 2.5 years, and it's going really well. El Salvador has really become the shining city on a hill. It's the new Camelot. It's, I always say, the new Statue of Liberty is the volcano in El Salvador. It's leading the world with economic freedom. We're making a move now for press freedom. And I think that if people remember the way the United States used to be, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, where the emphasis was on freedom, they should consider moving to El Salvador. This is really the heartbeat of freedom in the world today.
I'm more likely to move to Russia than El Salvador, but I can see how it attracted you because you've always been an advocate of Bitcoin, which many of the viewers will not actually understand. I'll be honest with you, Max. Even I, who took your advice, didn't quite know why I was taking it, except it was coming from you, and you're the expert. Tell us, what are El Salvador's Bitcoin policies and why they matter, what they do for other people, how many potatoes they put on people's plates?
Sure. Well, Bitcoin is becoming a huge factor in the election all over the world, and in the United States, all of the parties have put out a statement on Bitcoin. RFK Jr. is now what we say orange pilled. He's a full Bitcoin maximalist. Donald Trump came to the Bitcoin conference in Nashville, had a huge presentation about Bitcoin. The Democrats were anti-Bitcoin. Now they're pro-Bitcoin because Bitcoin is offering something in the world today that is desperately needed in the realm of money. Bitcoin is uncensorable, so you can't stop anyone from transacting in Bitcoin. Bitcoin is unconfiscatable, so you can't take anyone's Bitcoin from them. And Bitcoin is inflation proof. So no matter how much money the central banks print, it just means that the purchasing power of Bitcoin keeps going higher and higher. In El Salvador, the president recognized all of these attributes of Bitcoin a few years ago, made Bitcoin legal tender, and now the country's economy is booming. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And with Bitcoin and the introduction of what will soon be a Bitcoin bank and other attributes of Bitcoin, the country has the possibility to become completely debt-free. So that means no interest on debt that contributes to the GDP growth. So it has a remarkable list of benefits to the people of El Salvador. There's a lot of jobs that come with Bitcoin in the Bitcoin industry. A lot of Bitcoin companies and big Bitcoin companies are now moving to El Salvador, and they're creating lots of jobs. And like I said about this interesting attribute of Bitcoin that it's unconfiscatable is that for the first time in history, people who work for a living have a way to put that money that they earn away in something that's inflation-proof, unconfiscatable, and they can transact with anyone else without fear of any censorship. You know, you mentioned Iran a few moments ago. They were, of course, shut off from the SWIFT system a few years ago. They're now turning to Bitcoin to be able to transact without that risk. Talk about Russia. Russia had $600 billion seized from U.S. authorities. They're now turning to Bitcoin because it's unconfiscatable. So it's really remarkably changing the face of the global economy. I'm not sure why you would prefer Russia over El Salvador. I think, George, if you were to come and pay us a visit, you would open your eyes to what's happening here and maybe have a slightly different opinion, my friend.
I've been in El Salvador, but in darker times than the ones you described now. Tell me about the White House. Are they taking a hostile attitude to Bitcoin because Trump is warming to it and because RFK is something of a zealot in it? In which case, if Trump wins, do we see a big shift to Bitcoin in the United States? And what will that mean?
Well, all governments, it seems to me, and I think this would not be far from your thoughts as well, seem to be drifting toward authoritarianism. Certainly in the UK, there seems to be a drift toward authoritarianism. In the United States, there's a drift toward authoritarianism. And the Bitcoin is really the opposite of authoritarianism because it's perfectly decentralized. There's nobody who controls it. There's nobody at the center of it. And so it's the solution to an authoritarian regimes. And what's happening is that, I always say, you don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you, because it's a constant in a world of constant change. And so in the US, with Donald Trump has embraced Bitcoin because a lot of the funding is now coming from the Bitcoin lobbyists, in the U.S. who, when I told you to buy Bitcoin at $10, George, there are many people who bought Bitcoin at $10. It's now at $60,000 plus. So a lot of people have made hundreds of millions and billions of dollars. They're sitting there on their Bitcoin and they want a better world. So they're trying to get politicians to understand the ethos of Bitcoin, to understand why it's the best form of money ever created in the history of the world, and for a better world. Because when you have money that's inflation-proof, unconfiscatable, and uncensorable, you eliminate the problems of having a fiat bank where they print money constantly to debase the purchasing power of the consumers on the other end of the money printing. And they also take away the government's ability to, remember Julian Assange, when he was trying to raise money when he was being held in the Ecuadorian embassy, all the major credit card companies and PayPal shut him down. The only money that got to Julian Assange was through Bitcoin. I mean, that right there should have been a turning point in people's consciousness about the value of Bitcoin and free press. The free press, without a free press, you have really nothing, George. And Bitcoin allows free press to thrive in ways that you can't find in any other fiat money or payment rail system that are easily interrupted or censored by those who do not want free press, George.
Well, you advocate for it very eloquently, I must say. But what are the downsides? I can think of one obvious one. There are not a few charlatans in the business. I'm thinking of the guy who just went to prison, the big Democrat in the United States. Young man, filthy rich, billionaire, funding all these Democratic candidates and causes. But his whole thing went bust. What are the things to avoid is what I'm asking.
Right. Well, in the case of Sam Bankman-Fried, who had a company called FTX, they sold basically what are called altcoins, or I don't know what the policy is for cursing on your show, but euphemistically we call these shitcoins. These are centralized, censorable venture capital projects that are what we say orange washed. They come across and say, oh, we're like Bitcoin, but they're actually just trashy, centralized tokens, and they are gambling instruments essentially. So you can't make the comparison between anything Sam Bankman-Fried was doing and these altcoin markets and Bitcoin. Bitcoin stands alone as the only of these cryptos that is perfectly decentralized and unconfiscatable. None of the others stand up to that test, but people are gullible, and it doesn't just because you're talking about Bitcoin doesn't mean you get rid of gullible people. There are people every day that fall for scams, many scams, all types of scams, gambling scams. You get all kinds of things going on constantly. It doesn't speak to the viability of Bitcoin itself. It's like people sell fake gold. You know, you can buy up and say, oh, buy my gold. It turns out that it's just tungsten. It's not gold, right? It's fake gold. But that doesn't mean that gold is no longer a viable money or medium of exchange. Gold is still gold. The fact that people try to sell fake gold and get caught up in scams involved in gold, that doesn't change gold. Same thing with Bitcoin. People get caught up in scams because they're being sold something that they're told is Bitcoin or similar to Bitcoin. It's a scam, and they get hurt, but it doesn't change Bitcoin. Bitcoin has not proven itself to be really perfect money in every sense of the world. And this is having a profound effect in El Salvador, where the economy is growing. There's a sense of hope. People are, for the first time, able to save and with money that is unconfiscatable. And we're having a fantastic impact in El Salvador, and we're seeing that play out right now.
You mentioned gold. Warren Buffett seems to be dumping stock at quite a rate. He's moving presumably into other things. I presume that gold, silver, maybe even Bitcoin, or just cash is what he's up to. What would be his reasoning behind that?
Well, Warren Buffett is dumping a lot of stocks. He's dumping his Apple stock and his Bank of America stock, and he's putting it into cash. He's got over $300 billion in cash in his investment vehicle of Berkshire Hathaway. And if you study Warren Buffett, as I've done for decades, he looks at certain valuation metrics that would determine whether the market as a whole is overvalued and whether there are any bargains on offer. You know, the price of a stock, I learned when I was a stockbroker in New York many years ago, half of the price of a stock is determined by the overall market direction. Another quarter of the valuation is determined by the sector that that particular company is in. And then only 25% of a stock's direction is determined by the individual stock itself, because it's a market of stocks. And what Warren Buffett is obviously telegraphing to the investment community is that the market at this juncture in history is overvalued, and he's raising cash. He's raising his war chest so that when you have the correction, when you have and I think we're in for a major correction, he'll have dry powder. He'll be able to go in there and buy stocks on the cheap, which is he's very famous for doing that. So I think it's very typical of what Warren has done and what he says. And if you listen to what he's been saying for years now, this should be no shock in terms of he believes, based on what his actions are, that this market is at very highly overvalued.
Well, you mentioned correction. Others predict a crash. How big a correction? How big a crash might we be in for, and when do you think it's going to happen?
I think in February of 2022, when the Ukraine-Russia conflict began, it's the end of an era of globalization, and we entered into an era of deglobalization and de-dollarization. And that process has now taken a few years, but the world is de-dollarizing. The BRICS are moving away from the dollar. The dollar is not being used as world reserve currency for the reasons we just gave. Because the U.S. has weaponized the dollar. They would shut Iran off SWIFT, or they'll seize dollars from Russia. So these BRICS countries have decided to create their own inter-country currency payments and their own currency, which they'll get more details on that pretty quickly. So you're entering into a de-dollarization, which means ultimately, when you start to extrapolate what that means, is that America is a country with approximately $32-33 trillion in debt, and that debt rolls every day. It has to be refinanced every day, and most of the money that comes to refinance America's debt comes from outside of America. So at some point, if China, Japan, or others say, you know what, we're not going to buy America's debt anymore because we have an alternative, We have this other currency, which is over at the BRICS, or of course we have Bitcoin, which Christine Lagarde at the European Central Bank characterized as an escape hatch, which is absolutely true because you're escaping the fiat money world. That can very quickly turn into a selling rout where there's no buyers, there's no bid, there's nobody who wants the US Treasury bonds. And that historically, when you have a debt spiral is what it's called, when it starts to kick in, it happens very, very quickly. And I think we're at the end game. I think you bring up Warren Buffett, and I think you're spot on. I mean, that should tell people in the finance world the most successful investor in history is getting out of stocks because he thinks that things are at a tipping point. And part of that tipping point would be, as you point out, a correction. You know, these markets have been through 50% corrections fairly frequently over the past 40 or 50 years. You know, I lived through the 1987 correction. It was quite vicious. We had the 2008 crisis. I would put it this way, George. I would characterize the current market sentiment and conditions as kind of part two of the global financial crisis of 2008. If you recall, the world had a credit freeze. We went into a massive downturn, and the central banks had to get together and print a fresh, they called it $800 billion to bail out the banks, but it turned out to be closer to 16 or 17 trillion. But instead of fixing the problem, they simply expanded the credit limits of the banks that caused the problem to begin with. They gave them 10 times more credit facilities. So what did the banks do? They simply did the exact same thing that they were doing that caused the problem, but they did it on a scale that was 10 times bigger. So now we're in 2024 and the exact same thing is repeating, but it's 10 times bigger. So I think that this crash, this global crash that we're seeing is kind of unfolding, would be bigger than the 2008 crash. And the 2008 crash brought the world to the precipice of a global financial catastrophe. So I think we're on the doorstep of something bigger.
Nobody talks economics like you, Max, and many people miss your frequent broadcasts in the past on RT when we were all there. How do people follow you nowadays?
Well, you can most easily follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is simply, or X as it's called now, Max Keiser, and that's generally the easiest place to find me. And I direct traffic into our various enterprises and things that are happening from my X account of Max Keiser. I should mention that although you were not necessarily very aggressive buying Bitcoin at that time, Gayatri, as I understand it, has a huge Bitcoin position, George. So you should speak to your wife about this because apparently she's sitting on a vast fortune she hasn't told you about.
No, she's told me. She doesn't need to tell me. We have no secrets. Well, Max, it has been a delight as well as an education. Please give my love to your missus, and we hope in person to meet again, either in El Salvador or elsewhere. Thanks for joining us, Max Keiser. I told you he was a legend, and he just proved it all over again.